A 6-year-old prince whispered 3 words to a royal guard that would shake the foundations of Buckingham Palace. What he knew about Queen Camilla's past was something even the king hadn't fully understood. This is the story of an innocent revelation that threatened to rewrite royal history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Windsor Castle as young Prince Louis skipped through the East Gallery, his small shoes echoing in the vast corridor. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, and the castle was unusually quiet. Most of the royal family had traveled to Scotland for a private engagement, but Louis had stayed behind with his nanny, Maria, after complaining of a mild stomach ache the night before. At just 6 years old, Louis was known throughout the palace staff as the most curious of the Cambridge children. While Princess Charlotte carried herself with a composed grace beyond her years, and Prince George understood the weight of his future role, Louis remained blissfully unaware of royal protocol. He asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, wandered into rooms he wasn't supposed to enter, and had a peculiar habit of listening to conversations from behind curtains and doorways. On this particular morning, Louis had convinced Maria to let him explore the portrait gallery while she attended to some household matters. The nanny, a kind woman in her 50s, who had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades, knew the young prince well enough to understand that saying no would only make him more determined. She agreed, with strict instructions that he stay within the East Wing and return within 30 minutes. Louis walked slowly past the portraits of his ancestors, kings and queens who stared down at him with serious expressions. He paused before a painting of Queen Victoria, tilting his head as he studied her stern face. His mother had told him stories about the great queen, how she had ruled for so long and loved her husband deeply. Louis wondered if anyone had ever made Queen Victoria laugh. As he continued his exploration, Louis heard voices coming from one of the smaller sitting rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see 2 figures. One was Samuel, a royal guard who had been with the family for years and often played card tricks for Louis during boring formal events. The other person Louis didn't immediately recognize, but as he peeked closer, he saw it was Margaret, one of Queen Camilla's personal assistants. Louis knew he shouldn't eavesdrop. His mother, the Princess of Wales, had told him many times that listening to private conversations was impolite. But something about Margaret's tone made him freeze in place. She sounded upset, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't know what to do, Samuel," Margaret said, clutching a manila folder to her chest. "I found these documents in the Queen's private study. She had asked me to organize her files from the old Clarence House days, and this was hidden at the bottom of a locked drawer." Samuel, a tall man with graying hair and a kind face, looked concerned. "Margaret, perhaps you shouldn't be sharing this with me. These are private royal matters." "But that's just it," Margaret insisted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "These aren't just private matters. This could change everything. There's a birth certificate here, Samuel. A child. Queen Camilla had a child that nobody knows about." Louis's eyes widened. He pressed himself against the wall, his heart beating fast. A secret child? Like in the storybooks, his nanny read to him about hidden princes and princesses. Samuel took the folder from Margaret's trembling hands and opened it carefully. Even from his hiding spot, Louis could see the guard's expression change from curiosity to shock. His face went pale, and he sat down heavily in one of the antique chairs. "This can't be real," Samuel whispered. "The date on this certificate, if this is legitimate, this child would be an adult now," Margaret finished. 52 years old. Born before Queen Camilla married her first husband. Before anyone knew who she was, Louis didn't understand everything they were saying, but he understood enough. Queen Camilla, his grandfather's wife, had a secret. A big secret. The kind of secret that made grown-ups look scared. Samuel stood up abruptly, closing the folder. "Margaret, we need to return this immediately. We need to pretend we never saw it. Do you understand? The consequences of this information getting out could be devastating. But shouldn't someone know?" Margaret asked. "Shouldn't the king know?" "The king probably does know," Samuel said firmly. "And if he doesn't, it's not our place to tell him. We serve the crown, Margaret. Sometimes that means protecting secrets we wish didn't exist." Louis watched as Samuel handed the folder back to Margaret. The young prince's mind was racing. He thought about his grandfather, King Charles, who always seemed a bit sad even when he smiled. He thought about Queen Camilla, who tried to be nice to him, but always seemed nervous, as if she was worried about saying the wrong thing. As the two adults prepared to leave the room, Louis quickly ducked behind a large Ming vase. His small size made it easy to hide. And neither Samuel nor Margaret noticed him as they walked past, still speaking in hushed tones. Once they were gone, Louis emerged from his hiding spot. He stood in the empty corridor, processing what he had heard. A secret child. He had so many questions. Where was this child now? Why was it a secret? Did his father know? Did his mother? Louis knew he should probably forget what he heard, just like Samuel had told Margaret to do. But the secret felt too big to keep inside. It felt like when he had accidentally broken his mother's favorite vase and tried to hide it. Only the feeling in his tummy got worse and worse until he finally confessed. The young prince made his way back through the gallery, but instead of returning to Maria, he found himself walking toward the guard station near the south wing. He knew Samuel would be returning to his post soon, and Louis had decided something. He needed to talk to Samuel. He needed to understand. When Louis arrived at the guard station, Samuel was just settling back into his position. The guard's face still looked troubled, his usual warm smile absent. When he saw the young prince approaching, he straightened up and forced a professional expression. "Good morning, Prince Louis," Samuel said, bowing slightly. "You're exploring early today." Louis looked up at the tall guard, his blue eyes serious in a way that seemed too old for his young face. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, suddenly unsure. "How did you ask an adult about a secret you weren't supposed to know?" "Samuel," Louis finally said, his voice small. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Royal Highness," Samuel replied, though his voice was cautious. Louis glanced around to make sure they were alone. The corridor was empty, with only the distant sound of staff moving about their duties elsewhere in the castle. He stepped closer to Samuel and looked up at him with those innocent, questioning eyes that had gotten answers from adults his entire life. "What happens when you find out a secret about someone?" Louis asked. "A really big secret. Do you tell, or do you keep it inside?" Samuel's expression changed. He knelt down so he was at eye level with the young prince, his face serious but gentle. "Well, that depends on the secret, doesn't it? Some secrets are meant to be kept because sharing them would hurt people. Other secrets need to be told because keeping them hurts people more. But how do you know which is which?" Louis asked, genuinely confused. Samuel smiled sadly. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you just have to trust that the people who need to know will find out in the right way at the right time." Louis nodded slowly, but his face showed he was still troubled. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at Samuel. The guard's eyes suddenly widened with realization. He glanced around nervously and spoke in a low voice. "Prince Louis, were you in the East Gallery this morning? Near the blue sitting room?" Louis bit his lip, a habit he had when he was caught doing something he shouldn't. He nodded slowly. Samuel closed his eyes briefly and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he looked at Louis with a mixture of concern and resignation. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," Louis whispered. The guard stood up quickly, looking around to ensure they were still alone. His training and years of service kicked in, and he knew he needed to handle this situation carefully. A 6-year-old prince with knowledge of royal secrets was a complication no one had planned for. "Listen to me very carefully, Louis," Samuel said, using the prince's first name in a way he rarely did, making the moment feel more personal and urgent. "What you heard this morning is very complicated. It's the kind of thing that adults struggle to understand, and it's not something you need to worry about. But is it true?" Louis asked. "Does Queen Camilla really have a secret child?" Samuel hesitated. He had sworn oaths to protect the royal family, but he had also developed a genuine affection for the young prince standing before him. He couldn't lie to the boy, but he couldn't confirm what Louis had heard either. "Some things in life are complicated," Samuel finally said. "People have pasts, things that happened before we knew them. Queen Camilla had a whole life before she married your grandfather. We all did. And sometimes, things from those pasts are kept private for very good reasons." Louis processed this information with the seriousness of someone much older. Is the child okay? The secret one? The question caught Samuel off guard. Of all the things he expected the young prince to ask, concern for the unknown person was not one of them. It reminded him why he had always liked Prince Louis, despite the boy's tendency to cause minor chaos. The prince had a good heart. I don't know, Samuel admitted honestly. I don't know anything more than what you heard, and that's the truth. Louis nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. But then his face brightened with another thought, one that made Samuel's stomach drop. Should I ask Queen Camilla about it? Louis suggested innocently. Maybe she wants to talk about it. Maybe the secret makes her sad, and talking would help. That's what Mummy always tells me when I'm keeping something inside. No, Samuel said, more sharply than he intended. He immediately softened his tone. No, Louis. You must not speak to anyone about this. Not Queen Camilla, not your mother, not your father, not your siblings. Do you understand? This is very important. Louis looked confused and a bit hurt by Samuel's intensity. But why? Secrets make people sick. Mummy says so. Samuel knelt down again, placing his hands gently on Louis's small shoulders. Your mother is right about most secrets. But some secrets belong to other people, and it's not our job to bring them into the light. That's their choice to make. Do you understand the difference? Louis thought about this for a long moment. His young mind struggled with the concept, but he could sense the urgency in Samuel's voice and the worry in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. I think so, Louis said quietly. It's like when Charlotte writes in her diary. I'm not supposed to read it even if I find it, because those are her private thoughts. Exactly, Samuel said, relieved. Exactly like that. The guard stood up, and for a moment both he and the young prince stood in silence. Samuel hoped desperately that this would be the end of it, that Louis would keep this information to himself and eventually forget about it, as children often did with things they didn't fully understand. But as he looked at the prince's thoughtful expression, Samuel had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. Prince Louis had a curious mind and a strong sense of justice. The combination had gotten him into trouble before, and Samuel suspected it would again. Will you promise me something, Prince Louis? Samuel asked. What? Louis looked up at him. Promise me that if you feel you must talk to someone about what you heard, you'll come to me first, before you speak to anyone else. Can you promise me that? Louis considered this request carefully. After a moment, he extended his small hand for a handshake, something he'd seen his father do in formal situations. I promise. Samuel shook the small hand, hoping the promise would hold. As Louis turned to leave, the guard called after him, And Louis, you're a good boy. Your mother and father are very lucky to have you. Louis smiled at this, the first genuine smile since the conversation began. Then he ran off down the corridor, his footsteps echoing as he went to find Maria. Samuel watched him go, then pulled out his mobile phone. He stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to call someone, to warn someone about what had just transpired. But who would he call? What would he say? That a 6-year-old prince had overheard a conversation about Queen Camilla's past and now knew about a secret that could potentially embarrass the royal family. He pocketed the phone. For now, he would wait. He would hope that a child's promise would be enough to keep this particular secret contained. But deep down, Samuel knew that secrets had a way of coming out eventually. They always did. It was only a matter of time. 3 days passed since Prince Louis had overheard the conversation between Samuel and Margaret. The young prince had kept his promise not to tell anyone, but the secret weighed on him like a heavy stone in his pocket. He found himself distracted during lessons, staring out windows during mealtimes, and asking his nanny strange questions about where people go. They disappear from families. Maria noticed the change in the usually energetic boy. You've been very quiet lately, Prince Louis, she remarked one afternoon as they walked through the palace gardens. Is something troubling you? Louis kicked at a pebble on the path, watching it skip ahead of them. Maria, have you ever known something that felt too big to keep inside but you promised not to tell? The nanny stopped walking and looked down at the prince with concern. That sounds like a heavy burden for such young shoulders. Is this about something that happened at school? No, Louis said quickly. Then, Remembering his promise to Samuel, he added, "I can't really talk about it, but it's hard." Maria knelt down, adjusting Louis's collar with the tender efficiency of someone who had cared for many children over the years. "Well, my dear, sometimes keeping a promise is the bravest thing we can do, even when it's difficult. Your mother and father would be proud of you for honoring your word." Louis nodded, but didn't seem comforted. That evening at dinner, his distraction became more noticeable. The family had gathered for a rare, informal meal together at Kensington Palace. Prince William and Princess Catherine sat at opposite ends of the table, with George, Charlotte, and Louis arranged between them. The conversation flowed around topics of school, upcoming engagements, and George's recent interest in learning to fly helicopters like his father had once done. "Louis, you haven't touched your vegetables," Catherine observed, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you feeling unwell again?" "I'm fine, Mummy," Louis replied automatically, pushing peas around his plate with his fork. Charlotte, ever observant, leaned toward her younger brother. "You've been acting weird for days. Did something happen?" "Nothing happened," Louis said, but his voice lacked conviction. William exchanged a glance with Catherine. As parents, they had learned to read their children's moods with reasonable accuracy. Something was clearly bothering their youngest son, but pushing him when he wasn't ready to talk rarely worked. They decided to give him space, hoping he would come to them when he was ready. Later that night, as Catherine tucked Louis into bed, she sat on the edge of his mattress and brushed his hair back from his forehead. "You know you can tell Daddy and me anything, don't you? No matter how big or scary it might seem." Louis looked up at his mother, her kind eyes reflecting the soft glow of his nightlight. For a moment, he almost told her everything. But then he remembered his promise to Samuel and the guard's worried face. He remembered how Samuel had said some secrets belonged to other people. I love you too, darling." Catherine kissed his forehead and quietly left the room. But Louis couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the secret child. He wondered what it would be like to be a secret, to have a mother who couldn't talk about you. It made him feel sad and confused. His mind kept returning to Queen Camilla, trying to imagine her as a young woman hiding a baby away. It didn't make sense to him. The Queen Camilla he knew seemed stern sometimes, but not unkind. Why would she hide her own child? The following morning, fate intervened in the way it often does with curious children and royal secrets. The family had been invited to a small private gathering at Clarence House, King Charles's London residence. It was meant to be an intimate lunch with just the immediate family, including Queen Camilla, to celebrate Princess Charlotte's birthday. A few days early, before the official celebrations began, Louis had been quiet during the drive over, pressed against the car window watching London pass by. When they arrived, the family was greeted by palace staff and led into the drawing room, where King Charles and Queen Camilla waited.
"Oh, they're my grandchildren,"
King Charles exclaimed warmly, opening his arms. George approached first with a formal handshake that made his grandfather chuckle, followed by Charlotte, who accepted a hug. And finally Louis, who seemed hesitant. Queen Camilla watched the children with a careful smile. She had always found it challenging to connect with William's children, knowing that they held their grandmother Diana in their hearts in a way she could never replace. She didn't try to, but the awareness of it created an invisible barrier that made their interactions feel slightly formal, slightly careful. "Hello, Louis," Camilla said warmly, extending her hand to the young prince. Louis looked at her hand, then at her face. For the first time, he really studied her features, trying to see if there was any sadness hidden behind her smile. Did she think about her secret child? Did she miss them? "Hello, Queen Camilla," Louis said softly, taking her hand. But instead of the brief handshake she expected, Louis held on, looking up at her with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see more than a 6-year-old should. "Are you quite all right, dear?" Camilla asked, slightly unsettled by the intensity of his gaze. Before Louis could respond, Catherine called him over to greet some of the other guests who had arrived. The moment passed, but Camilla found herself watching the young prince throughout the lunch, puzzled by his behavior. The meal was pleasant enough, filled with family conversation and Charlotte's excited talk about her birthday plans. Louis remained mostly quiet, picking at his food and watching the adults with unusual attentiveness. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way Queen Camilla's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The way she touched her necklace repeatedly, as if it were a nervous habit. The way she seemed to hold herself slightly apart even when surrounded by family. After lunch, while the adults enjoyed coffee in the drawing room, the children were allowed to explore the garden. It was a beautiful autumn day, the golden leaves scattered across the manicured lawn, and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of the last roses of the season. George immediately challenged Charlotte to a race to the far end of the garden, and both took off running, their laughter echoing across the grounds. Louis started to follow, but then noticed something that made him stop. Through the window of a ground-floor study, he could see Queen Camilla had stepped away from the group. She stood alone, looking at something in her hands. Curiosity overwhelming his usual obedience, Louis quietly made his way to the study window. He crouched down beneath the sill and slowly raised himself just enough to peek inside. Queen Camilla stood with her back to the window, holding a photograph. Even from his limited vantage point, Louis could see it was old. The colors faded with time. As he watched, Queen Camilla raised a hand to her face, and her shoulders shook slightly. She was crying. Louis had never seen a queen cry before. It seemed wrong somehow, like seeing a statue come to life. The image troubled him deeply. He was so focused on the scene inside that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching behind him until a gentle hand touched his shoulder. Louis jumped, spinning around to find himself face to face with his grandfather, King Charles. "Goodness, Louis, you gave me a start," Charles said with a bemused smile. "What are you doing crouching in the flower beds?" Louis's mind raced for an explanation, but the truth tumbled out before he could stop it. "Grandfather, why is Queen Camilla crying?" Charles's expression shifted immediately. He glanced through the window and saw his wife in her private moment of grief. His face softened with understanding and sadness. He gently took Louis's hand and led him away from the window to a bench beneath an old oak tree. "Sometimes adults cry, Louis," Charles said carefully. "Even queens. We all carry things that make us sad sometimes." "Is she sad about someone?" Louis asked, his voice small. Charles studied his grandson's face, seeing something there that gave him pause. There was knowledge in those young eyes, or at least the shadow of it. "Why do you ask, Louis?" This was the moment. Louis could feel it. He could keep his promise to Samuel and say nothing, or he could break it and ask his grandfather about the secret. The weight of the decision felt enormous, far too big for a 6-year-old boy. Grandfather Louis began hesitantly. If someone had a secret, a really big secret about something that happened a long time ago, would it be bad to know about it? Charles tensed slightly. He had been involved in enough royal scandals and secrets over his lifetime to recognize when something sensitive was being circled. That would depend on the secret and how one came to know about it. "Louis, has someone told you something they shouldn't have?" "Not exactly," Louis said truthfully. "I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, and now I can't stop thinking about it. It makes me sad." The king took a deep breath. He looked at his youngest grandson, so innocent yet clearly troubled by whatever knowledge he'd stumbled upon. Charles had spent his entire life managing secrets, understanding which ones served a purpose and which ones only caused pain. He also knew that secrets discovered accidentally often caused the most damage, because they festered without context or explanation. "Would it help to talk about what you heard?" Charles asked gently. "Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." Louis bit his lip, remembering his promise to Samuel. But Samuel had said to come to him first before talking to anyone else, and Louis hadn't done that. Maybe talking to his grandfather wasn't the same as breaking his promise. His grandfather was the king, after all. Surely the king should know important things. "It's about Queen Camilla," Louis whispered, looking down at his small hands. "I heard someone say she has a child that nobody knows about. A secret child from a long time ago." The color drained from King Charles's face. For a long moment, he sat completely still, as if turned to stone. Louis watched anxiously, afraid he'd said something terribly wrong. When his grandfather finally spoke, his voice was quiet and strained. "Where did you hear this, Louis?" "I was in the East Gallery at Windsor," Louis explained quickly. I heard Samuel and Margaret talking. They found some papers. A birth certificate, I think. They didn't know I was there. I wasn't trying to spy, grandfather, I promise. It just happened. Charles closed his eyes and rubbed his temples with his fingers. Of all the ways for this particular secret to emerge, he had never imagined it would be through his 6-year-old grandson overhearing palace staff. The absurdity and tragedy of the situation struck him simultaneously. "How long have you known?" Charles asked. "A few days," Louis admitted. "I promised Samuel I wouldn't tell anyone. But it's been really hard, grandfather. And just now seeing Queen Camilla crying, I thought maybe she's sad about the secret child. Maybe she misses them." Charles felt his heart clench at his grandson's innocent interpretation. The truth was so much more complicated than a child could understand, layered with decades of pain, difficult choices, and circumstances that belonged to a different era. But looking at Louis's earnest face, Charles realized that perhaps a simplified truth was better than letting the boy's imagination fill in the gaps. "Louis, what you heard is true," Charles said finally, "but it's a very old truth, from before I even knew Camilla. She was very young, younger than your mother is now, and life was very different then. The child, a daughter, was given to another family to raise. It was what people sometimes did back then when they weren't married and couldn't care for a baby properly." Louis processed this information, his young mind trying to make sense of adult complications. "So the daughter doesn't know Queen Camilla as her mother?" "She does know," Charles said quietly. "They found each other many years ago. But they agreed to keep their relationship private to protect both of their lives. The daughter, her name is Sarah, has her own family now, her own life. She never wanted to be part of the royal world." "But why does that make Queen Camilla cry?" Louis asked. Charles smiled sadly. "Because even though she made the right choice for that time, and even though Sarah has had a good life, Camilla still carries the pain of giving up her first child. That kind of pain doesn't go away, Louis. It just becomes part of who you are. Some days it hurts more than others." Louis sat quietly, taking this in. His view of the world was shifting, becoming more complex. He was learning that adults, even queens and kings, carried secret sadnesses. That sometimes there weren't clear answers about right and wrong. That love could hurt even when you did everything you thought was best. "Does it help that they found each other?" Louis asked, hopefully. "That Sarah knows now?" "I think so," Charles said, "but it's complicated. They see each other sometimes, very privately. Sarah has chosen not to be publicly acknowledged, and Camilla respects that choice. It's a secret they keep together now, not to hide shame, but to protect something precious and private." Louis nodded slowly. Then a thought occurred to him. "Grandfather, am I in trouble for knowing? Will Samuel be in trouble?" "No one is in trouble," Charles assured him, though his mind was already working through the implications of staff members finding and discussing confidential documents. "But Louis, this is something you must never speak about to anyone else. Not your parents, not George or Charlotte, not your friends. This is Camilla's story to share if she ever chooses to, and Sarah's privacy to protect. Can you understand that?" "I think so," Louis said. "Like how I wouldn't want someone telling everyone about my private things." "Exactly," Charles said. "You're a very understanding young man. Louis, I'm proud of you for coming to me with this. Even though I know it was difficult." They sat together in companionable silence for a moment. Grandfather and grandson united in the guardianship of a delicate secret. Finally, Charles stood and extended his hand to Louis.
Dad, shall we go back inside?
"I believe there's birthday cake waiting for your sister." Louis took his grandfather's hand, but before they started walking, he looked up one more time. "Grandfather, is Queen Camilla going to be okay?" Charles looked back at the window where they'd seen Camilla crying. "She's stronger than people think, Louis. We all are when we have to be. But I'm glad you care enough to ask." As they walked back toward the house, Charles kept Louis's small hand in his own, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Another secret added to the collection he carried, but this one felt different. This secret had been discovered by innocence and was now held by innocence. There was something almost pure about that, even in its complication. When they entered the drawing room, Camilla had returned to the others, her face composed, though her eyes were slightly red. She looked at Charles questioningly when she saw him with Louis, noting something different in the way they stood together. Charles gave her a small nod, and understanding passed between them. Somehow, she knew. The secret was out, at least partially, and their youngest family member now carried it too. Louis went to join his siblings for cake, but not before giving Queen Camilla a small, shy smile. She smiled back, puzzled but touched by the warmth in it. She didn't know yet what had passed between Louis and Charles, but she would learn soon enough. For now she returned to her role, the face she showed the world. Even as the photograph she'd been holding remained tucked in her pocket, pressed close to her heart. That night, after the family returned to Kensington Palace and the children were tucked into bed, King Charles made a difficult phone call. He sat in his private study at Clarence House, the room dim except for the lamp on his desk, and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago, but rarely used. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello, Sarah, it's Charles," he said quietly. "I hope I'm not calling too late." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah Mitchell, a 52-year-old teacher living in Hampshire, had grown accustomed to unexpected calls from the king over the years, but they still gave her a start every time. To the world, she was simply Sarah Mitchell, divorced mother of 2 grown children, living a quiet life far from the spotlight. Only a handful of people knew the truth of her birth. "Not at all," Sarah replied, her voice cautious. "Is everything all right? Is Mother okay?" Sarah had taken to calling Camilla Mother during their private conversations, though it had taken years for the word to feel natural. They had found each other when Sarah was 35, after years of Sarah's searching through adoption records and hitting dead ends that had clearly been erected to protect someone important. When the truth finally emerged, both women had wept, though whether from joy, grief, or relief, neither could say. "Camilla is fine," Charles assured her, "but something has happened, and I felt you should know. Someone outside our immediate circle has learned about you." "Who?" "The press." "No, thank goodness. Nothing like that," Charles said quickly. "It's my grandson, Louis. He's 6 years old. He accidentally overheard palace staff discussing documents they found, including your birth certificate. He asked me about it today, and I had to tell him at least part of the truth." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She walked to her kitchen window, looking out at her dark garden where she'd spent countless hours working over the years, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing growing things. "What did you tell him exactly?" Charles recounted the conversation with Louis, leaving nothing out. As he spoke, he could hear Sarah moving around on her end of the line. The familiar sounds of her making tea, a ritual she'd told him, helped her think during difficult moments. "He sounds like a sweet child," Sarah said finally. "Asking if Mother was okay, worried about her crying. That's kind." "He is kind," Charles agreed, almost unsettlingly perceptive for his age. "But Sarah, this raises some concerns. The staff who found those documents will need to address that. And there's always the possibility that Louis, despite his promises, might say something accidentally. 6-year-olds aren't always reliable secret keepers. You want me to disappear further?" Sarah asked, her voice flat. "Move away. Cut contact?" "No," Charles said emphatically. "That's not what I'm suggesting at all. In fact, I wonder if perhaps it's time to reconsider how we've been handling this. You've been hidden away for so long, Sarah. Both you and Camilla have sacrificed so much for discretion." "Charles, we've been through this," Sarah said tiredly. "I have my life. A good life. My children don't know. My ex-husband never knew. My colleagues and friends don't know. If this comes out publicly, everything changes. I become the Queen's secret daughter instead of just Sarah. My children become the Queen's hidden grandchildren. It's not fair to them." "I understand," Charles said. "But what's happening now isn't sustainable either. Documents being found, staff members gossiping, a child stumbling onto the truth. The secret is becoming harder to contain. Perhaps controlled disclosure, on your terms, would be better than waiting for it to leak out uncontrollably." Sarah set down her teacup harder than she intended, the sound sharp through the phone. "Easy for you to say. You're used to living in the public eye. I'm not. I never wanted to be. No. Charles said gently. And I'm not pressuring you. I just want you to think about it. Talk to Camilla about it. She's coming to visit you next week, isn't she? Thursday, Sarah confirmed. She's coming for lunch. We're going to work in the garden together. She likes the roses. Charles smiled at that image. Camilla had told him about these visits. She and Sarah had found common ground in gardening, how they could spend hours working side by side with minimal conversation, comfortable in shared silence. It was a relationship built slowly over 17 years, cautious and precious. Talk to her about this, Charles urged. About Louis knowing, about the documents, about whether it's time to make a different choice. And Sarah, whatever you both decide, I'll support it. You know that? After they said their goodbyes, Charles sat in his study for a long while, thinking about the strange turns life took. When he'd married Camilla, he'd known about Sarah. Camilla had told him early in their relationship, needing him to know this fundamental truth about her past. He'd met Sarah a few times over the years, always in private, always careful. He'd watched his wife grieve for the daughter she'd given up and the grandmother. She couldn't publicly be to Sarah's children. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, Louis lay awake in his bed, thinking about everything his grandfather had told him. He understood more now, but understanding somehow made it sadder. He thought about Sarah, the secret aunt he didn't know. He wondered what she was like, if she was kind, if she had his grandfather's ears, or his grandmother Diana's smile, or if she looked like Queen Camilla. The next morning at breakfast, Louis was unusually quiet again, pushing his cereal around his bowl without eating. Catherine watched him with growing concern. This had been going on too long. Something was clearly troubling her youngest son. And despite what Charles had told her last night, that Louis had asked some questions about family and secrets, but it was handled. She knew there was more to the story. "Darling," Catherine said, setting down her coffee cup, "would you come with me for a walk after breakfast?" "Just the two of us?" Louis looked up, saw the gentle but determined look in his mother's eyes, and nodded. He knew that tone. It was the one she used when she was going to get to the bottom of something. When being the Princess of Wales took second place to being his mom. An hour later, mother and son walked through Kensington Gardens, Louis's small hand tucked into Catherine's larger one. It was a gray morning with the threat of rain, and they had the paths mostly to themselves apart, from a few early joggers and the ever-present security detail that trailed at a discreet distance. "Your grandfather mentioned you had some interesting questions yesterday," Catherine began carefully. "He said you talked about secrets." Louis nodded but said nothing. "Are you worried about something, sweetheart? You've seemed troubled for days now." "Can't tell you," Louis said quietly. "I promised grandfather, and I promised Samuel before that." Catherine stopped walking and knelt down so she was eye level with her son. "Louis, look at me. If someone has told you to keep a secret that makes you uncomfortable, or if you're worried about something, I need you to know that you can always tell me. No promise is more important than your safety and well-being." "I'm not in danger, Mummy," Louis assured her. "It's not that kind of secret. It's just sad. It's about Queen Camilla, and grandfather said it's her story to tell, not mine. So I can't break her trust." Catherine studied her son's face, seeing a maturity there that made her heart ache. When had her baby become this thoughtful, empathetic boy who worried about other people's trust? She pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "I'm very proud of you," she whispered into his hair. "Keeping someone else's confidence, even when it's hard, shows real character. But Louis, if it ever becomes too much to carry alone, please come to Daddy or me. We can help you, even if we can't fix everything. Okay?" "Mummy," Louis said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. They continued their walk, talking about lighter things, Louis's upcoming school project on dinosaurs, whether they should get a dog, a perennial topic in the Cambridge household, and what costumes everyone might wear to a fancy dress party Charlotte's friend was planning. By the time they returned to the palace, some of the weight seemed to have lifted from Louis's shoulders, even if the secret remained. That Thursday, Queen Camilla drove herself to Hampshire in an unmarked car, as she did once every few months. She wore simple clothes, jeans, and a jumper, with her hair pulled back and minimal makeup. She looked like any well-dressed woman in her 70s heading out for the day. The security that followed her was discreet, hanging back to give her the privacy she craved during these visits. Sarah's house was a charming cottage with a wild garden that Camilla had helped design over the years. As Camilla pulled into the drive, Sarah emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a gardening apron. She was a handsome woman, tall like Camilla, with similar bone structure and the same slightly crooked smile. They embraced briefly, still somewhat awkward with physical affection after so many years of distance. Then they headed straight for the garden, as they always did. Something about working with the earth made difficult conversations easier. As they pruned the roses together, Camilla working methodically through the climbing varieties while Sarah tackled the tea roses. Charles's conversation with Sarah hung in the air between them. "He told you about Louis?" Camilla finally asked, not looking up from her work. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "A 6-year-old knows about me now. That's nerve-wracking." "Charles says he's very mature for his age," Camilla offered. "Empathetic. He promised not to tell anyone else." "Children make promises they can't keep," Sarah said pragmatically. "Not because they mean to break them, but because they're children." He could tell a friend at school. "Kids brag sometimes. I know a secret about the Queen. It only takes one overheard conversation by the wrong person." Camilla set down her pruning shears and looked at her daughter. "Charles thinks we should consider going public. Controlled disclosure, he called it." Sarah laughed without humor. "Of course he does. He spent his whole life with everything he does splashed across newspapers. He can't imagine why we'd want anything different." "That's not entirely fair," Camilla said quietly. "He's trying to protect us. He thinks the secret is becoming harder to contain and that we should control the narrative before someone else does." "And what do you think?" Sarah asked, meeting her mother's eyes directly. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I think I'm tired," she said finally. "Tired of hiding you? Tired of pretending I don't have another daughter when people ask about my family? Tired of seeing your children, my grandchildren, and not being able to acknowledge them as such? But I'm also terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. The judgment, the scrutiny you'd face, the way it would change everything. My children think I have ordinary grandparents who passed away before they were born," Sarah said softly. "I've lied to my own children for their entire lives. Sometimes I wonder if the lie is worse than the truth would have been." "Have you thought about telling them?" Camilla asked. 100 times, Sarah admitted. "But they're adults now, with their own lives. Jessica is getting married next year. Do I drop this bombshell before her wedding? Oh, by the way, darling, Queen Camilla is actually your grandmother. Michael is trying to make partner at his law firm. How does it affect his career if suddenly everyone knows he's secretly royal adjacent?" They returned to their work, the soft snip of pruning shears and the occasional bird call, the only sounds for several minutes. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Tell me about Louis. What's he like?" Camilla smiled, surprised by the question. "He's delightful, actually. Mischievous, curious, surprisingly kind. He asked his grandfather if I was going to be okay. Can you imagine? A 6-year-old worried about my feelings?" "He sounds like a good kid," Sarah said. "Like the kind of nephew I'd be proud to have if things were different." The word nephew hung in the air between them, heavy with all the relationships that existed in secret. Sarah was Louis's aunt. Louis was Sarah's nephew. Camilla was grandmother to both, though only one of those relationships could be acknowledged. "What if we started small?" Camilla suggested tentatively. "What if you met him? Just once, privately. You could see the child who holds our secret. It might give you peace of mind about whether he can be trusted." Sarah considered this. "And how would we explain my presence? Who would I be to him?" "A friend of mine," Camilla said. "Which is true, in a way. We are friends, aren't we? Beyond the biology?" "I'd like to think so," Sarah said carefully. They'd been building toward friendship for 17 years. But the foundation was complicated by all the years before, by the adoption, by the separate lives they'd led. Every interaction was still slightly tentative, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that would shatter the delicate connection they'd constructed. "Let me think about it," Sarah said finally. "Meeting Louis, it feels like a big step." "Take your time," Camilla assured her. But Sarah, however this unfolds, whatever we decide, I want you to know that giving you up was the biggest regret of my life. I was young and frightened, and I believed it was the only option. I know, saying it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know. Sarah stopped pruning and turned to face her mother fully. In the afternoon light, the resemblance between them was striking. I know, she said softly, and I've made my peace with it. The Mitchells were good parents. They loved me well. I had a happy childhood. It wasn't what you might have given me, but it was good. You don't need to carry guilt about that anymore. Tears welled in Camilla's eyes. It was the most direct absolution Sarah had ever given her. They stood together in the garden, surrounded by the roses they'd nurtured together. Two women bound by blood and choice, by past pain and present care. Thank you, Camilla whispered. They finished their gardening and went inside for lunch. They talked about ordinary things. Sarah's work at the school, student who was struggling with reading Camilla's upcoming engagement calendar, the ridiculous hat she'd have to wear to a state event. They were finding their rhythm, mother and daughter, creating something new from the fragments of what might have been. When Camilla left that evening, Sarah stood in her doorway watching the car disappear down the lane. She thought about Louis, this child who now knew her secret. She thought about her own children, Jessica and Michael, and the truth she'd kept from them. She thought about her mother, growing older now, and how many more years they might have together. Maybe it was time. Maybe the secret had been kept long enough. Maybe Louis, in his innocent discovery, had accidentally opened a door that had been locked too long. Back at Kensington Palace, Louis was getting ready for bed when his father came to say goodnight. William sat on the edge of the bed, and father and son looked at each other in comfortable silence for a moment. "Grandfather tells me you've been very grown up about something," William said carefully. "I don't need to know what it is, but I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. Being able to keep confidences is an important skill, especially in our family." Daddy, Louis asked suddenly, "Do you think secrets always hurt people?" William thought about this seriously. Not always. Some secrets protect people. Some secrets are kept not because we're ashamed, but because something is private and precious, and we want to keep it safe. But secrets can become burdens too if we're not careful. The trick is knowing the difference. "How do you know the difference?" Louis asked. "That's the hard part," William admitted. "Sometimes you don't know until later. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts and the people around you to help you figure it out." Louis nodded, processing this. "Daddy, I love our family." William smiled and ruffled his son's hair. "We love you too, Louis, very much. Even when we're complicated." After William left, Louis lay in the dark, thinking about all the complications he didn't fully understand yet. Somewhere in Hampshire, a woman he'd never met was thinking about him too. And in Clarence's house, Camilla was looking at an old photograph, wondering if maybe, finally, it was time to stop hiding. 2 weeks passed before Sarah made her decision. She called Camilla late one evening, her voice steady but nervous. "I'll meet him, Louis, but not at any royal residence. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere I can leave if it becomes too much." They chose Kew Gardens for the meeting. It was public enough that no one would question why various people were there, but vast enough that they could find privacy. Security was arranged discreetly. King Charles offered to facilitate the introduction, but Sarah preferred it be just her and Camilla. With Louis, they settled on a Saturday morning in late October, when the autumn colors would be at their peak and the gardens would be busy enough for them to blend in. Catherine and William were told only that. Camilla wanted to take Louis on a special outing to see the gardens, and that a friend would be joining them. Catherine, who had become increasingly suspicious that something significant was unfolding, agreed, but insisted on driving Louis to the meeting point herself. On the Saturday morning, Louis dressed carefully in his navy jumper and nice trousers. Sensing somehow that this was an important day, even though no one had explained why, as Catherine drove him to Kew, she glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Louis, do you know why Queen Camilla wants to spend time with you today?" she asked carefully. Louis met his mother's eyes in the mirror. "I think she wants me to meet someone special. Someone she cares about." Catherine pulled into the car park at Q and turned to face him fully. I want you to remember something, darling. No matter what happens today or what you learn, Daddy and I are always here for you. If you have questions or feel confused about anything, we can talk about it. All right. All right, Mummy, Louis said. Though he was puzzled by her serious tone, Queen Camilla was waiting near the entrance. Dressed casually in brown trousers and a cream-colored jacket, she smiled when she saw Louis and greeted Catherine warmly, though there was tension in her shoulders that Catherine noticed but didn't comment on. Thank you for trusting me with him, Camilla said to Catherine, replied, then knelt down to Louis. Be good. I'll pick you up in 2 hours. After Catherine left, Camilla took Louis's hand, and they entered the gardens together. They walked slowly, Camilla pointing out various plants and trees, clearly working up to something. Louis remained quiet, sensing her nervousness. Finally, they reached a secluded area near the Temperate House, where a tall woman sat on a bench wearing jeans and a navy jacket, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw Camilla and Louis approaching, she stood up slowly, her face pale, but determined. Louis, Camilla said gently, I'd like you to meet my friend, Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, this is my grandson, Prince Louis. Sarah and Louis looked at each other for a long moment. Louis saw a woman who looked like Queen Camilla, but softer somehow, less formal. Sarah saw a small boy with bright blue eyes, full of intelligence and curiosity. Neither spoke immediately. Hello, Louis finally said, remembering his manners. Hello, Louis, Sarah replied, her voice catching slightly. It's very nice to meet you, Camilla gestured to the bench. Shall we sit? I thought we could talk for a bit, the three of us. They settled onto the bench, Louis between the two women. For a moment, no one spoke. The sounds of the garden filled the silence, birds calling, distant voices of other visitors. Leaves rustling in the light breeze. Louis Camilla began carefully. Do you remember what your grandfather told you about me having a daughter from a long time ago? Louis nodded, his eyes widening with sudden understanding as he looked at Sarah. Sarah is that daughter, Camilla said softly. She's my first child, born before I married anyone, before I became part of the royal family. For many years we didn't know each other, but we found each other again when she was grown up, and we've been getting to know each other ever since. Louis looked from Camilla to Sarah and back again. So you're your family? We are, Sarah confirmed, though it's a secret that very few people know. You're actually one of only a handful of people who knows the truth. Louis processed this information with visible concentration. Then he turned to Sarah. That means you're my aunt, sort of. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Sort of, yes. Though I've never been able to be an aunt to you before. Why is it a secret? Louis asked, the question he'd been holding since the beginning finally emerging. Why can't people know? Sarah and Camilla exchanged glances. Camilla nodded, giving Sarah permission to answer. When I was born, Sarah began, choosing her words carefully, things were very different than they are now. Your grandmother was very young, not much older than your mother is now, and she wasn't married. Back then, people were very judgmental about things like that. So it was decided that I would be adopted by another family, people who could give me a stable home and a normal life. But didn't that make you sad? Louis asked. And didn't it make Queen Camilla sad? Yes, Sarah said simply. It made us both very sad. But sometimes, adults have to make difficult choices, and they do the best they can with the circumstances they're in. The family who adopted me, the Mitchells, were wonderful people. They loved me very much and gave me a happy childhood. So while it was sad, it wasn't all bad. When we found each other again, Camilla added, we had to decide whether to tell the world or to keep our relationship private. Sarah chose privacy, and I respected that choice. Louis looked at Sarah thoughtfully. Do you have children? That would make them Camilla's grandchildren too, right? Sarah smiled through her tears. I do have children. 2, actually. A daughter named Jessica, who's about to get married, and a son named Michael, who's a lawyer. They're adults now. Do they know about Queen Camilla? Louis asked. No, Sarah admitted. They don't. I've never told them. That's been one of the hardest parts of this whole situation. I've kept this secret from my own children because I wanted to protect them from all the attention and complications that would come if people knew the truth." Louis was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised both women. "That sounds lonely. Keeping such a big secret from everyone." Sarah let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Camilla put an arm around her daughter's shoulders. Louis, seeing Sarah's distress, reached out and took her free hand in his small one. "I'm sorry you had to be lonely," Louis said softly. Sarah looked down at the small prince holding her hand. This child, who was technically her nephew, and something inside her broke open. She pulled Louis into a gentle hug, careful not to overwhelm him, and whispered, "Thank you for saying that." They sat together for a while, 3 generations bound by blood and secrecy. Other visitors to Kew Gardens passed by occasionally, seeing only a grandmother, mother, and child enjoying a day out. No one looked twice at them. In their casual clothes, in this public space, they were invisible in the way the royal family rarely got to be. "Can I ask you something?" Louis said after a while, looking up at Sarah. "Of course," Sarah replied. "When you found Queen Camilla again, after all those years apart, what was the first thing you said to each other?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "I think I said, 'I've been looking for you my whole life.' And she said, 'I never stopped thinking about you.'" "That's beautiful," Louis said solemnly. Camilla wiped at her eyes. "Louis, you've been very mature about all of this. More mature than most adults would be. But I need to ask you again to keep this secret. Not forever, maybe, but for now. Can you do that?" Louis nodded seriously. I promise." "But—" He hesitated. "But what?" Camilla encouraged. "But wouldn't it be better if it wasn't a secret anymore? If Sarah could be part of the family properly, if her children could know they have a grandmother who's the queen. Secrets seem like they hurt more than they help, out of the mouths of children," Camilla thought. She looked at Sarah, who was looking at Louis with an expression of wonder. "He's right, Sarah said quietly. "I've been thinking about it since Charles called. This secret has protected me, yes, but it's also imprisoned me. And it's imprisoned you too, Mother. Neither of us has been free to just be ourselves." "What are you saying?" Camilla asked carefully. "I'm saying maybe it's time," Sarah replied. "Maybe Louis stumbling onto the truth was meant to happen. Maybe we're being given an opportunity to make a different choice. The media attention would be intense," Camilla warned. "Your life would change completely." "My life changed completely the day I found out you were my birth mother and that you'd married the Prince of Wales," Sarah countered. "I've been living in this strange limbo ever since. At least if the truth is out, I wouldn't have to lie anymore. I wouldn't have to keep you at arm's length. I could actually be your daughter." They talked for another hour, there on that bench in Kew Gardens, while Louis listened and occasionally asked questions. They discussed the practicalities of disclosure, the timing, how to tell Sarah's children first, how to manage the press. Louis watched as the 2 women, grandmother and daughter, began to plan a future where they didn't have to hide, when Camilla's phone buzzed with a reminder that they needed to head back soon. They stood up slowly, reluctant to end this moment. Sarah knelt down in front of Louis, putting her hands on his small shoulders. "Thank you," she said seriously. "You didn't mean to discover our secret, but you've handled it with more grace and wisdom than I think any of us had a right to expect. You've given us a gift today, Louis, the courage to consider being honest. Will I get to see you again?" Louis asked hopefully, "now that I know who you are?" Sarah glanced at Camilla, who nodded. "Yes," Sarah said. "I think you will. Properly this time, as family." As they walked back through the gardens, toward the exit, Louis held both their hands. Swinging between them occasionally, like any child with their mother and grandmother, people smiled at them as they passed. Seeing only an ordinary family enjoying the autumn day, Catherine was already waiting when they emerged from the gardens. She took one look at Camilla's face, tear-stained but peaceful, and at the unknown woman beside her who bore such a striking resemblance, and understanding dawned. She didn't say anything, just gave Camilla a small nod of acknowledgement. "Mummy, this is Miss Mitchell," Louis said, still holding Sarah's hand. "She's Queen Camilla's special friend. Can she come to dinner sometime?" Catherine looked at Sarah, saw the hope and fear in her eyes, and made a decision. "I think that would be lovely, Louis. Perhaps we can arrange something soon." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "Thank you," she mouthed to Catherine. In the car on the way home, Louis was quiet but not sad. Catherine watched him in the mirror, seeing something different in her youngest son. He'd aged somehow, just a bit, in the way children do when they're entrusted with important things. "Was it a nice visit?" Catherine asked. "Very nice," Louis replied. "Mummy, do you think people can be family even if they haven't always known each other?" Catherine smiled. "I think family is made in all sorts of ways, darling. Love is what makes a family, not just blood or time together." "That's what I think too," Louis said contentedly. That evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine told William everything she'd pieced together. William listened quietly, processing the implications of what had clearly occurred. "So Louis discovering the secret has potentially changed everything," William said finally. "It seems so," Catherine agreed. "Sometimes I think that boy sees more than all the rest of us put together." 2 months later, the official announcement was made. It was brief and dignified, released through Buckingham Palace in the careful language palace communications always used. Queen Camilla acknowledged having placed a daughter for adoption in 1972 before her first marriage. The daughter, now known as Sarah Mitchell, had been found years ago, and they had maintained a private relationship. They were choosing now to acknowledge their relationship publicly. The statement requested privacy for Sarah and her family as they adjusted to the change in circumstances. The media reaction was immediate and intense, but less judgmental than Sarah had feared. Times had changed. Stories of adoption and reunion were common enough now that the public largely responded with sympathy rather than scandal. There were questions, of course, speculation about why the secret had been kept so long, interest in Sarah's life and family. But there was also understanding. Sarah's children, Jessica and Michael, learned the truth from their mother before the announcement went public. Jessica cried. Michael sat in stunned silence. But after the shock wore off, both assured their mother that nothing fundamental had changed. She was still their mom, regardless of who her birth mother was. The first official family photograph that included Sarah was taken on Christmas at Sandringham. In it, Sarah stood slightly behind Camilla, not quite comfortable yet in her place within the royal family, but present. Louis stood beside her, holding her hand, young prince who had accidentally sparked a revolution in his family's history. Samuel, the guard who had first discovered the documents with Margaret, saw the photograph in the newspaper and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The secret he'd worried about, tried to contain, had finally been freed. He hoped it would bring everyone peace. In the quiet moments, when the press attention died down and life found a new normal, Camilla would sometimes look at her daughter and grandson together and marvel at how things had unfolded. A curious 6-year-old's accidental discovery had led to a healing that might never have happened otherwise. Louis, for his part, seemed unchanged by his role in the drama. He went back to being a regular 6-year-old, causing minor chaos and asking too many questions. But sometimes, when he saw Queen Camilla and Sarah together, he would smile in a way that suggested he understood something profound about secrets and truth, and the courage it takes to move from one to the other. He had learned in his young life that secrets could protect but also imprison, that the truth, while scary, could also set people free, that families were complicated and beautiful and worth fighting for. Even when the fight meant simply being honest about who you were and who you loved, and in the end, wasn't that what being royal was supposed to be about? Not the crowns and titles and protocols, but the courage to be truthfully, completely human, even when the whole world was watching. Years later, when Louis was grown, and people asked him about the time he'd helped reveal Queen Camilla's secret daughter, he would say simply, "I just asked if she was okay." Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. But on this Christmas day at Sandringham, with his entire complicated, beautiful family gathered around him, Prince Louis was simply a 6-year-old boy holding his Aunt Sarah's hand, eating too many sweets and feeling proud that sometimes even little princes could help make big things right. The secret that had frozen a royal guard in shock had become a story of reunion and healing, And it all started with one small prince who cared enough to ask if someone he barely knew was going to be okay. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply compassion. And sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths.